The year 2025 poses a central question that echoes through the halls of power from Washington to Moscow. How does the Islamic Republic of Iran, faced with the greatest internal dissatisfaction in its history, an active and increasingly visible opposition in exile, and direct military conflicts, still manage to survive? The answer lies not in the supposed strength of the regime itself, but in a paradoxical, unspoken agreement among opposing global and regional powers who, for their own strategic reasons, fear the chaos that would follow the regime's fall more than they desire its collapse. This text will explain in detail why and how this negative consensus works. On one side are the United States, which, despite aggressive rhetoric and military strikes, adheres to a doctrine of containment, not nation-building, avoiding the adventure of open regime change, aware that there is no unified opposition ready to take control. In contrast, France, guided by its own economic interests and a desire to maintain its role as a diplomatic bridge, actively works to preserve stability, which in practice means maintaining a dialogue with the existing establishment in Tehran. Other powers have also deeply woven their interests into this complex game. Great Britain, with its historical ties and intelligence channels, plays a cautious balancing act. Israel and Saudi Arabia, although Iran's biggest regional adversaries, fear a total collapse that could trigger an unpredictable wave of violence and refugees on their borders. And at the very center of this storm, as an unexpected epicenter, is Albania, a small Balkan nation that, by providing refuge to the US-backed MEK organization, has become a direct target of Iranian retaliation and a living stage for this global struggle. Meanwhile, dissatisfaction is growing within Iranian society, a fact confirmed by independent research. The most prominent study, conducted by the Netherlands-based organization Gaman, the group for analyzing and measuring attitudes in Iran, on a sample of 158,000 respondents inside the country, showed that as many as 80% of the population wants a democratic replacement of the regime. In this context, Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah, has emerged as the most popular candidate to lead a potential transitional council, with support ranging between 32% and 40%. These figures have given him legitimacy and transformed him into a serious political actor. Therefore, the struggle taking place in 2025 is not just a fight against a theocratic dictatorship. It is also a clash of two opposition visions, personified in Pahlavi and the MEK, as well as a collision of global strategies that will determine whether the fall of the regime, if it happens, will lead to a democratic dawn or to a new, even more dangerous chaos in the Middle East. During 2025, Reza Pahlavi ceased to be merely a symbolic figure of nostalgia for pre-revolutionary Iran. He evolved into a proactive, strategically minded political actor with a clear plan and a global platform. His strategy was not based on calls for armed struggle or the creation of paramilitary formations, but on a sophisticated combination of international diplomacy, media pressure, and, most importantly, encouraging the regime's collapse from within. The peak of his activities was a major conference held in July in Munich, titled The Convention of National Cooperation to Save Iran. The gathering of over 500 prominent activists, artists, former politicians, and representatives of various opposition currents, with the notable exception of the MEK, represented the most serious attempt to date to create a broad opposition front. Pahlavi's goal was not to create a new organization with himself at its head, but to position himself as a neutral, unifying figure who could bring together different, often conflicting groups, liberal, nationalist, women's, artistic, and professional, in the name of a common national goal. This approach was also visible in initiatives like the Action 100 Cities, Action 100 Städte, which aimed to create a network of cooperation and visibility, not a rigid hierarchical structure. He was building a coalition, not an organization, aware that this was the only way to overcome decades of fragmentation. One of his most dramatic and ambitious steps was the Defection platform for regime officials. He announced that by July 2025, over 50,000 people, including members of the military, police, and state administration, had registered as being ready to abandon the regime and support a transition. This platform, carefully protected and secured with digital encryption, was an attempt to create an internal base for a future non-violent takeover of power. Its psychological effect was enormous. It sent a message to both the regime and the people that the cracks in the system were deep and that loyalty was weakening. He compared his vision to historic turning points, calling the current situation our Berlin Wall moment. In speeches from Paris to Washington, he appealed to Western leaders to stop providing a lifeline to the regime, arguing that it was on the verge of collapse and needed only a little push to fall. Pahlavi did not just offer rhetoric. At conferences in Munich, Geneva, and Washington, he presented a concrete 100-day plan for a transitional government, which includes establishing a temporary technical administration under the supervision of a transitional council, preparing for free elections, abolishing repressive bodies like the morality police and revolutionary courts, and opening up the media and digital space. The economic foundation of this plan was the Iran Prosperity Project, a serious three-phase strategy: stabilization, legal and political transition, and post-conflict recovery with international investment, supported by numerous Iranian experts and international consultants. A key element of his strategy was his open distancing from the imposition of a monarchy. Despite his lineage, he clearly emphasized that the future form of government, a constitutional monarchy or a republic, would be decided by the Iranian people in a referendum. Furthermore, he increasingly expressed his personal preference for a republican model, which was a smart move to win over a broader spectrum of opposition forces. The fortress in Albania, the other face of resistance. While Pahlavi fought his battle on the global stage, a different drama unfolded in Albania, where the heavily guarded Camp Ashraf III houses the other major Iranian opposition force, the Mujahedin-e-Khalq, MEK. Their arrival is a story of geopolitical shifts. Once allies of Khomeini, then his fiercest enemies, they found refuge with Saddam Hussein. After the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, their position became unsustainable under pressure from Baghdad's pro-Iranian government, and they faced attacks and the threat of extermination. Through intense diplomacy, they convinced NATO ally Albania to accept thousands of MEK members between 2013 and 2016. In reality, Albania became host to one of the world's most organized and controversial opposition groups. Camp Ashraf III is a city fortress with its own infrastructure and ideology, led by Mariam Rajavi, president of the MEK's political wing, the NCRI. The camp became a center for lobbying and media operations. Their ideology, a blend of Shia Islam and Marxism, rejects the supreme leader's rule and advocates for a secular, democratic republic. However, this presence came at a high price for Albania. Since 2022, the country has been targeted by devastating cyber attacks from the hacker group Homeland Justice, linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The attacks, which paralyzed government services, escalated in 2025, placing Albania on the front line of a digital war after it had already severed diplomatic ties with Iran. The Iranian regime also announced the execution of 2 MEK members on July 27, 2025, a clear message of retaliation. In response, the US Senate passed Resolution S-Res 1145 in April 2025, condemning the threats and calling for the protection of the dissidents. The MEK thus became a symbol of a different resistance, organized and disciplined but also deeply isolated. Their past, including their alliance with Saddam, made them unacceptable to many other opposition groups. They were not seeking allies. They saw themselves as the only legitimate alternative. France and Iran. From Khomeini to 2025, is Paris still protecting the Tehran regime? Of all the Western powers, France has played the most controversial role in the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. When Ruhollah Khomeini was granted asylum in 1978 in Neauphle-le-Château near Paris, few could have predicted that this very exile would become the center of one of the most profound political ideological revolutions of the 20th century. France provided him with media logistics, freedom of movement, and communication with the Iranian people, which directly contributed to the fall of Shah Pahlavi. The French authorities at the time did not do this out of pure ideological support. Rather, it was out of realpolitik interests, anti-imperialist solidarity, and a desire to maintain influence in post-Shah Iran. However, several decades later, as internal tensions in Iran are once again boiling, the question arises, is France still quietly supporting the regime in Tehran, even as it officially presents itself as a champion of human rights and democracy? The official positions from Paris in recent years seem clear. Condemnation of death sentences against protesters, support for women's rights, public calls for the release of imprisoned activists and French citizens, and criticism of Iran's support for Russia. However, behind these official statements lies the pragmatism characteristic of French foreign policy. Although it condemns repression, France has not broken diplomatic ties with Iran. On the contrary, its interests dictate caution. The French energy company Total was a key player in the Iranian energy sector for years, and Paris has never completely closed the door to that market. In addition, France wants to play the role of a bridge between Iran and the West, which gives it prestige, but also requires maintaining communication with the regime. Finally, there is the fear of instability and refugee waves that a regime collapse could trigger, which is another reason why Paris does not want abrupt change, but rather a gradual transformation. This restraint is reflected in its attitude towards the opposition. France has not supported any exile structure, whether it be the MEK or Reza Pahlavi's platform. French security services have even restricted the activities of some Iranian opposition groups in Paris, and no significant French politician has publicly supported Pahlavi, nor has any transitional body been recognized. If we compare 1978 and 2025, the difference is clear. In 1978, France actively contributed to the revolution by providing asylum to Khomeini. In 2025, it balances its interests by condemning repression, but fundamentally supports stability, not the overthrow of the regime. It can be concluded that France does not protect Tehran actively, but its pragmatic policy of tolerance towards the Islamist establishment objectively benefits the regime's survival. Why Trump doesn't want regime change in Iran, even after the 2025 bombings. Despite the aggressive U.S. military response to Iranian attacks during 2025, former President Donald Trump, who has since announced his return to the White House, has not called for an open regime change in Tehran. Although he approved a series of precise airstrikes on Iranian infrastructure, including intelligence centers in Syria and drone warehouses in western Iran, Trump's rhetoric has remained carefully balanced. Strong retaliation, but not a systemic change of government. In May 2025, following a series of Iranian attacks on U.S. and allied targets in Iraq and the Golan Heights, Washington carried out a limited but fierce air campaign. The targets were carefully chosen. No strikes on civilian facilities or central political institutions in Tehran. At the same time, officials from Trump's circle repeatedly emphasized, "This is not regime change. This is terror containment." This stance, seemingly paradoxical, stems from several key factors. The first is Trump's historical skepticism towards interventions. Even as a candidate in 2016, he was a vocal critic of the Iraq War, calling it a disaster, and of the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. His America First doctrine involves avoiding expensive and unpredictable nation-building ventures. The second reason is the lack of a unified and credible opposition in Iran. In Trump's eyes, overthrowing the regime without a clear replacement means opening the door to chaos similar to that in Libya or Syria. Finally, there is geopolitics from the shadows. Key U.S. allies, though opponents of Tehran, have their own reasons for caution. Great Britain, with its deep economic and intelligence ties, prefers predictable stability. Israel, though the regime's greatest enemy, fears the anarchic vacuum that would result from its fall. The current government has an address to which pressure can be applied, whereas chaotic militias would be unpredictable. Saudi Arabia, though a regional rival, is terrified of the possibility of wider Sunni-Shia chaos that would spill across its borders. Therefore, Trump's policy represents a balanced response to pressures from all sides, a military show of force to appease the hawks, but avoiding regime change to satisfy pragmatic interests and prevent unpredictable chaos. The contrast between the strategies of Pahlavi and the MEK in 2025 could not be greater. Pahlavi utilized soft power through diplomacy and consensus building, while the MEK relied on hard power through its rigid organization and pressure. Pahlavi's base was decentralized and global, connecting the diaspora with potential defectors, whereas the MEK's base was physically concentrated and isolated in Albania. Pahlavi presented himself as a unifying coalition builder, while the MEK demanded loyalty to its own vision, dismissing all others. Their relationship was icy. The MEK accused Pahlavi of being inactive, while Pahlavi's circle questioned the MEK's democratic credibility. This deep rift was the greatest gift to the Iranian regime, as it prevented the creation of a united front capable of delivering a decisive blow. In a watershed moment for the Iranian opposition, exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has convened the most diverse coalition of anti-regime forces to date. On July 26, 2025, in Munich, over 500 opposition figures, including intellectuals, former officials, activists, artists, and representatives of ethnic and ideological groups, gathered for what was called the Convention of National Cooperation to Save Iran. Pahlavi, long viewed as a unifying figure in exile, declared that the Islamic Republic has reached its end and called for a peaceful transition led by the Iranian people. The Munich Convention marked the first serious attempt to consolidate opposition forces under a transitional leadership framework, with Pahlavi provisionally appointed to coordinate efforts until free elections can be held in a post-regime Iran. Unlike previous opposition efforts, which were fragmented and ideologically divided, this initiative brought together monarchists, Republicans, secular Democrats, Kurdish representatives, and supporters of the woman life freedom movement. Central to the coalition's principles are secularism, territorial integrity, civil liberties, and a referendum to determine Iran's future form of government, whether monarchy or republic. To understand the regime's reaction to these opposition activities, one must understand its deep-rooted paranoia. Since its inception, the Islamic Republic has been obsessed with exporting the revolution and creating an axis of resistance. Its network of proxies, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to Hamas, the Houthis, and Shia militias in Iraq, was created as a defensive wall. This strategy is a product of the trauma from the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, a brutal conflict that instilled a deep fear of direct invasion into the regime's psyche. Therefore, the regime views any form of organized opposition as an existential threat. Pahlavi's diplomatic offensive is seen as a Western-inspired velvet revolution, while the MEK in Albania is treated as a terrorist knife aimed at Iran's heart. The regime's response is always the same: brutal repression at home and aggressive action abroad. The cyber attacks, executions, and assassination attempts are all part of this defensive doctrine. The year 2025 brought the Iranian uprising to a new level of visibility, yet it also exposed its greatest weakness: deep internal division. On one hand, Reza Pahlavi has established himself as the most serious candidate to lead a transition, with a concrete plan and measurable support. His strategy combines the symbolic capital of the past with a technocratic model of transition and a call for national unity based on human rights. The uprising in Iran is therefore at a crossroads. The biggest question is not if the regime will fall, but what will come after. Despite everything, Pahlavi is the closest thing to a transitional leader who, in the event of a collapse, could quickly mobilize support and implement a peaceful transition. His historic role is still taking shape, but it is clear that without his participation, no option for change is complete. The Berlin Wall moment he speaks of will not come just by tearing down the external walls of dictatorship, but also by overcoming the deep walls of mistrust that divide those who wish to replace it.